Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Ellwood, and we're here at the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Kennedy School. Welcome. We're very, very pleased to have you all here. This is actually just about my favorite event every year. And the reason is we are here to celebrate first the two people who did remarkable things in founding the Kennedy School, Tom Schelling and Richard Neustadt. But we're especially here to try and celebrate a set of values which they epitomized and that we hope at our best the Kennedy School epitomizes. And the way we choose to do that is to find others who epitomize those very same values and that we can point to and admire. And indeed, the only rule of the Neustadt and Schelling Awards is we can't select among ourselves, which seems appropriate, at least some modesty associated. I cannot imagine a more ideal combination of recipients this year, and I want to turn to and talk about them in a moment. But first, I want to mention the fact that the Neustadt and Schelling Awards came about shortly after I became dean, thanks to the generosity of one man, and that's David Rubenstein, who's sitting right over there, hiding in the corner, as is his wont. And he's truly a remarkable man, a remarkable philanthropist, and he's been a remarkable gift to this school. I'd also like to acknowledge a couple of other folks in the audience today. First of all, with us we have Vartan Gregorian, who's sitting right over here. He is the president of the Carnegie Corporation of New York. He's former President of Brown, many other remarkable things. But his most important achievement in the entire world is that since its beginning, he has been the head of the selection committee of the Neustadt and Schelling Award. The other members of this selection committee are Donna Shalala, Nan Cohane, Glenn Hubbard, and Paul Volcker. So thank you very much, Vartan. In addition, we have Beth Neustadt, who is the daughter of Mr. Neustadt right here. Please, Beth is now quite around Harvard, and of course Dick Neustadt was this remarkable man who brought a set of experiences and connections to the world, but also cared very, very deeply about and helped found this institution. He was, if you were a president and you were transitioning, if you didn't have Dick Neustadt centrally involved in your transition, we knew ahead of time your presidency would fail, so no one did it. So it's actually, we couldn't really test this for sure, but he was part of everyone. And he was really such a thoughtful man who understood so much about government. And I'm very happy to report that Tom Schelling and his wife Alice are here. Tom is right here. Tom is simply a Nobel Prize winner. He's often credited as being the founder of game theory. He represents a group of academics that have taken the very best of theory and also made them relevant and understandable on areas, in Tom's case, as diverse as why is there such a traffic jam on the way to the Cape, as turns out there's a mattress that fell off somebody's truck and we're all waiting and taking a look, and since we've waited so long, of course we're all going to look at that mattress, thereby delaying everyone behind us, to how do you prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. And so he was another one of the very great minds that helped found this institution. And so we're thrilled to have you here, Tom, and to have this award in your honor. I want to now talk about the Neustadt Award. And the Neustadt Award is given to someone whose work is noteworthy for the practical application of powerful ideas involving policy and practice. This is the case of practitioners or people who have spent considerable time as policymakers or working closely with them. The body of work should be driven by intellectual or scholarly ideas as well as a strong set of values, and it should represent an outstanding contribution to society. Among previous award winners have been Bill Brayton, Alice Rivlin, Paul Volcker, Mohammed Yunus, Senators Sam Nunn and Richard Lugar. This year's Neustadt Award winner is Mary Robinson. Mary is a leader with a clarion voice and a tough spine, with strength drawn from a keen eye for justice. An early example. She made headlines as a radical in 1969, as one of the University of Dublin's 3 members in the Irish Senate. What she said was so outrageous that she was denounced from the pulpit of Ballina Cathedral. Here are the things she found troubling and that she called for change on. She said women should be allowed to serve on juries. She said that Ireland should eliminate the requirement that women resign from the civil service as soon as they get married. And she, and this was the biggest outrage, called for the legal right to the availability of contraception. She has demonstrated her passion for public service, her commitment to improving the human condition globally, and her ability to skillfully use leadership positions across sectors to advance these values across a powerful and colorful lifetime. She was born of a family in Ireland that was itself a historical mix of rebels against and servants of the crown, and both her parents were physicians. And indeed, she has credited her parents with instilling in her the idea as a female she had just the same potential and the same right and opportunity to be as accomplished in the world as her 4 brothers, an idea that was not entirely common at that time in Western Ireland or in most of the world. The world owes her parents a great debt because she has given generously of her mind and her values and has made a great impact. She studied law at Trinity College, Dublin and King's Inn in Ireland. And she spent a year here in Cambridge at Harvard Law School, which she described as a miserable, terrible winter. Now, I have to just say one thing. As much as I admire Mary Robinson, you ain't seen nothing. This winter was so, never mind. Okay. We got 7 feet in 3, okay, so we are very lucky that she was willing to come back. And fortunately, spring has returned, so all is well. In her 20s, she was called to the Inner Bar's senior counsel and appointed Reed Professor of Law at Trinity College. And her early political career included election to Dublin City Council, as well as the aforementioned Irish Senate. She's also worked as a legal advisor on the campaign for homosexual law reform. After a tough campaign, Robinson became the first Labour Party candidate, the first woman, and the first non-Freehanafoil candidate in the history of the contested presidential elections to win the Irish presidency, and she was inaugurated as the 7th president in 1990. She was remarkably popular as president. She took an elected non-executive office that previously had a relatively mild reputation and breathed new life and energy as she viewed it as an opportunity to contribute her moral voice. She brought the president to the presidency legal knowledge, deep intellect, and political experience. She reached out to the Irish diaspora and, following an old Irish custom, put a symbolic light in her kitchen window in her official residence, which became seen as the sign of Ireland thinking about its sons and daughters around the world. She extended a hand of friendship to Northern Ireland and changed the face of Anglo-Irish relations when she became the first serving president to visit the UK and meet Queen Elizabeth II at Buckingham Palace. Despite occasionally being at odds with the church, as in 1969, she actually established a quite close working relationship. And this ability to bridge differences would become a cornerstone of her career. She was the first High Commissioner of Human Rights to visit Tibet. She presided over the 2001 World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa as Secretary General. Deciding to be close to the victims of human rights and give voice to those groups, she visited Somalia and Rwanda. She stepped down from this post and became involved in numerous NGO activities, co-founding the Council of Women World Leaders and serving as the honorary president of Oxfam. She was also part of a group founded by Nelson Mandela, and Desmond Tutu and Graça Machel, known as the Elders, that seek to bring wisdom, leadership, and integrity to bear on the world's toughest problems. She is the 24th and first female chancellor of the University of Dublin. She has received numerous honorary degrees and awards, including the 2009 Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Barack Obama. And now she's served as the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy to the Great Lakes region in Africa from 2013-2014, and now she's taken up the post as Special Envoy for Climate Change. She heads the Mary Robinson Foundation, Climate Justice, a center for the education of and advocacy of sustainable and people-centered development in the poorest countries. Perhaps her leadership can be best summarized by quoting from the jury when she was awarded the Social Science Principal de Asturias Prize in 2006 when they commended her for, quote, offering her nonconformist, brave, and far-reaching voice to those who cannot speak for themselves or can barely be heard. Ladies and gentlemen, Mary Robinson. Mary, please come on up and we'll hand you this. And Beth, if you'd be willing to come forward. You, please. And there's an envelope yet to go. Just by way of those of you that come before the Neustadt and Schelling Awards, we've often had it in the evening. We have a different evening event tonight. But what we're going to do this time is after I've introduced each of our awardees, we're going to take away the podium and then have a discussion about what's happening and what's going on in the light. So let me now talk about the Schelling Award. Schelling Award is given to someone whose ideas have had a powerful scholarly influence and also a major identifiable impact on public policy. Think in this case of scholars who have spent a significant portion of their time in academia, though this is not a requirement. Past recipients include Amartya Sen, Esther Duflo, Dr. Harold Varmus, Howard Rafa, and Sarah McClanahan. And this year I'm delighted to present our award to Bill Nordhaus. Now there are two ways to grasp the basis and scope of Bill Nordhaus's work. The first is obvious, is in some ways a usual one, start with an early life. And indeed, the New York Times did a piece on Bill, actually Bill and his brother, about a year ago, and they labeled Nordhaus a, quote, Yale economist. By the way, I think when they called him a Yale economist, both of those were compliments. A Yale economist who is seen as a leading contender for the Nobel Prize, came up with the idea of a carbon tax and effectively invented the economics of climate change. But to get there, they said that growing up in New Mexico in the 1950s with his brother Bob and their father, a specialist in energy and Native American law, New York Times said they, quote, grew up steeped in the beauty of the landscape, the economics of energy, and the power of science. They skied, fly fished, explored the family's 50,000-acre sheep ranch, watched oil towns go boom and bust, and talked of the nuclear weapons on the road to Los Alamos. But there's another way to kind of understand and get a sense of Bill Nordhaus. One of the favorite articles that he's written, or as a part of a book really, describes the history of lighting throughout history, starting with the domestic use of fire and ending with electricity and the like. Now, he really has written a terrifically interesting article that goes through period by period exactly when the big events happened and when this or that, and we know we first did fire and then we had a way of creating fire and moving to gas lights and kerosene and so forth. Ultimately going through the electrical light era and so forth. Now, his interest was not strictly in lighting, though it is actually quite fascinating. He wanted to use it to make a point about how we measure price changes and national output. Suppose, for example, that everyone is using gas lighting, as they did in 1883. And some fellow like Edison comes along and creates electric lighting. Okay, here's the question. What just happened to the consumer price index? Now, I know not everyone that would be their first question, but it turns out to be an unbelievably important question because the consumer price index determines a great deal on everything from what we're going to do in Social Security increases to deciding the wealth of nations. And of course, at the very moment that gets invented, nothing happens because Edison, no fool he, priced electrical lighting to be just about the same price as gas lighting to make money. But over time, quite quickly, the cost of gas kind of kept going up. Cost of electricity went down, and of course the technology evolved in lighting. And so if you measured the price index by saying, well, how much would it cost to run a gas light today? The answer is quite high. But nobody's using them, and how do you make those adjustments and the like? And for economists, that's a great and interesting set of issues. Technology confuses us a great deal in trying to think about how prices of the past should be thought about in the future when the world is so different. And this was a brilliant way to understand and think about these things. And this is the sort of things that Bill Nordhaus does. What he does is he does his level-headed best to bring together the both theoretical and empirical insights to find answers to interesting questions. If it turns out that pollutants are imposing costs on those on all of us, but those producing the pollutants are not paying for it, well, set a price on the pollutants. Well, that's kind of standard economics, though he made it standard economics. But at what price? Particularly on climate. If you think about, wait, it's going to go into the future, it's the whole world, how do we think about what price for climate? Well, so then you have to design the Dynamic Integrated Climate Economy Model, DICE. It, quote, integrates an end-to-end fashion, in end-to-end fashion, the economics, carbon cycle, climate science, and impacts of a highly aggregated model that allows weighing the costs and benefits of taking steps to slow greenhouse warming. In other words, it can tell you what the price should be at every different point and what implications it might have going forward. And he asked next, and he's been this year the president of the American Economic Association. It wasn't until just recently. And he decided, very often, the president of the American Economic Association always gives a big talk at the meetings. These talks are often big, global, reflections on what's happened or whatever else. But Bill Nordhaus has always been looking towards the future. And so he instead said, okay, here's the deal. We want to do something about climate change, and we have got the biggest free rider problem there is. Every country would like all the other countries to take care of climate change and not them. And after all, most countries, not the US and China, but most countries actually aren't a very big part of the problem. But collectively, they are the problem. So he came up with the notion of clubs. And he said, well, the club of nations that decide they want to do something actually could decide to impose tariffs and other kinds of things on the nations that weren't willing to do something, thereby changing the incentives and the like. No doubt I've gotten this wrong, but our guest can correct us in a minute. The point is, this is a man who is constantly trying to say, how do I use ideas and theory and evidence to change things? No surprise that he was the first chair of the advisory committee of the Bureau of Economic Analysis to think about federal statistics. He's been on the faculty of Yale since '67, a full professor of economics since '73, and also a professor at Yale's School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. From 1977 to '79, he was a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. From 1986 to 1988, he served as provost at Yale. I did note here, this was just 2 years. This is a wise man. In 2004, he was awarded the prize of Distinguished Fellow by the American Economic Association before being elected president of the American Economic Association to serve 2014 and 15. He will be chair of the Boston Federal Reserve Bank also from 2014 and 15. He's on all kinds of awards. He's author of numerous books and regulated things like Growth and Welfare, Is Growth Obsolete?, The Efficient Use of Net Energy Resources, Managing the Global Commons, Warming the World. And drum roll, please, he was the joint author of Paul Samuelson's classic textbook, Economics, which exposed several generations, including a large fraction of the people in this room, to the magic and terrors of economics. His most recent book on climate change is called The Climate Casino. His career embodies the innovation, leadership, and public service across sectors that we aspire to as faculty members and strive to inspire in our students. Perhaps the American Economic Association put it best when in 2004 they selected him as a distinguished fellow. They said, throughout his career, William Nordhaus has displayed a knack for asking large questions and addressing them with simple but creative insights. It sounds like a whole lot like Tom Schelling to me, and so it's very fitting that we give this year's Schelling Award to Bill Nordhaus. Bill? Well done. Thank you. Tom, could you come up? We'll have you stand in the middle and have Tom stand over there. All right. So as I said before, we're about to remove the podium here, put up a couple of chairs, give us just 2 minutes, and we'll begin a conversation. So I think we are going to do this. Oh, here they come. Good. Mary and Bill, could you please come and join me? Please. All right, we're going to carry on a conversation here for a bit, and then there'll be a chance for you to ask questions of either of our panelists here. So let me ask actually both of you to start with a kind of basic question. What motivates you? What makes you focus on the things you care about? Where does that all come from? Mary?
Well, I think the motivation has changed a little bit as time went on. It's, for me, something to do with fairness, justice. I mean, I had a very early need to care about human rights and equality because I was wedged between 4 brothers, 2 older than me and 2 younger than me. So from the very beginning, this was part of it. Now it's very personal too. I'm lucky enough to be an Irish grandmother with 5 grandchildren, and they range in age between 11 and 1. And I think a lot about them, and I think a lot about their future. And I think about the fact that they'll be in their 40s in 2050. No, sorry, the youngest will only be 35. But that's their sort of age, midlife. They will share the world with 9 billion people. A climate-constrained world, maybe a climate-really disrupted world. And I often think back what they will think about us, particularly during this year. That gets me out of bed, full of vigor in the morning.
Is there some incident or thing that you look back on that you're most proud of? Maybe not the most impactful, whatever, it's something you sort of, that's really something that was important to me.
In a funny way, I think I've learned that you can do a lot as an individual, but if you can strengthen an institution, that's even more sustainable. So to be able to flesh out the presidency in Ireland and make it much closer to people and more relevant to a lot of what was going on in Ireland, and then taking the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, which was a very beleaguered, underfunded, poor office in the back end of the Palais des Nations when I started, and tried to strengthen it and try to get funding and try to get the administration better and all the nuts and bolts things that are tough and boring, everything. But just at the end of my 5 years, to see an office that actually was beginning to give leadership on human rights for the UN and know that that can then go on. I think they're the things that, if I'm looking back, I feel that was worth doing. Yeah.
How about you, Bill? I quoted the New York Times, your background. Where do you get your drive? What makes you focus on what you do?
Well, the sheep ranch was not as large as they said. They got.
I'm just quoting the New York Times. My impression is you can trust everything there.
I think what has.
We'll fix it. Don't worry.
What has motivated me is being part of coming out of the, say, New Mexico experience, but I'll talk more about my professional experiences, being part of this institution of universities. And I think of it as these institutions are, after all, very old, almost as among the oldest institutions in the world, human institutions. And they are like a very large family. So I have, as a student, being a student of people who were my teachers, and then meeting people like Tom Schelling relatively early in my career, having students that I worked with, having colleagues. So that was actually very formative in the sense that you're getting ideas, you're getting tools, if you like, from the people you work with, from your teachers, your colleagues, your students. But then at every point, you're looking outside and asking, in the way Mary described, what are the issues today that these tools could apply to? So very early on issues of technology, and you mentioned lighting, which was an application of that. And then economic growth, and then later on environmental issues and climate change. So I would say the way there's more reflection here than actually happens, but is to take the tools that I learned and I feel comfortable with, and to use them to address some of the key issues that are outside my study, so to speak. And I think that's what I think we in the academic world do, both with our students and in our writing, is to take the tools of whatever our discipline is and see how they can shed light on these enduring social issues.
But we in academia are often accused of actually often focusing on very, very narrow topics, or topics that are of only interest to the discipline and so forth. You clearly have never done that. Do you think that's an unfair criticism, or how do you think about that?
Well, you may not have read everything, so you don't know all the little bitty things. And also what I would emphasize is how many dead ends there are for, I think for everybody, but in our research, how many times you go down something and it leads nowhere. I was thinking about, there's this little maze we have in children where you go in and then you follow it down and then you come to a dead end and you got to work your way back and go down another little path. I think there's a lot of that. And so you've got to be willing to, when you get to the dead end, to say, this was a dead end, I wasted however much time. But it's a dead end either because it's, I guess, can make any progress with it, or because it's really not that important an issue. So one of my colleagues, I'll just say one thing my colleague said is the most important, Jim Tobin actually, many of you know, when I was young, said the most important decision a young scholar can make is what to work on. And I think we need to step back and ask ourselves that question all the time.
Is there something that you've written or were part of and so forth that you were most proud of or most engaged with?
Well, there are a lot of things. I think I do have a particular fondness for lighting. I'll just tell one story. So one day I was trying to figure out how a light bulb worked. This was back in the era of the compact fluorescent, and somebody said they don't work in freezing weather. So I decided I had better figure out if they work. So I went out and bought one and put it in the freezer. And my wife Barbara, who's here, came home. She's used to my peculiarities, and she opened the freezer and said, I think, have you gone out of your mind? But then I explained it, and so we raced with the light bulb, which had been at 0 for several hours, put it in the light, turn it on, and it worked. But I think that I have a particular fondness for that because it did involve trying to track down all these kind of weird, like the Babylonian period. I'll just say one other thing. So this says something about academic life. It turns out we had a PhD student at Yale who has just written a dissertation on wages and prices in Babylonia. And where in the world could you just walk across town and meet such a person? And that actually was kind of emblematic of what life has been as an academic, as a researcher.
My first question was, how in the world could you figure out what prices were like in Babylonia? You were very early to a set of issues around climate change. You and Tom were talking upstairs earlier about the fact that you were together on some small group that was convened by President Carter, because then, was it Prime Minister, whatever, of Germany, was Chancellor of Germany, was troubled about carbon dioxide emissions, and Carter had no idea what or why. You already knew something about that. Tell me a little bit about your history with this issue.
Well, so I had been working on economic growth and technology as a graduate student in the 1960s, and actually it turns out that was too hard, so I basically gave it up. It was just to think about the economics of technological change. I'm not sure if Mike Shearer is here, but he and I worked on that about the same time. And so, but then I turned to thinking about other issues with respect to economic growth, and particularly constraints on growth that you mentioned earlier. And what were the different constraints, and looked at a number of energy. And it was clear at that point that, say in 1970, that climate change was a potential constraint. But there was no linkage between the science at that time, and the physical science, I should say, and the social science. So the way I got started, it was just one of those lucky accidents. I happened to be spending a year in Vienna at the International Institute, founded by none other than Howard Rafa. And Howard was director at that time. It was first director. And I shared an office with a climatologist, and he asked what I was doing, and I asked what he was doing, and we became interested. He became interested in economics, and I became interested in climatology. And it became clear at that point that you could actually link them up. And so during that year, it was the first time. But I'd say, I think it was clear surely by the late 1950s and surely by early 70s, that this was going to be a very big issue. But as you say, we didn't really know how to link that together with the social sciences, with energy systems, and how you would deal with this for economic policy. But that's how I got started.
And Mary?
Well, listening, I really feel quite humble because when I was serving as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, I never had any sense of climate change as being an issue that might affect human rights, which is what I'm really concerned about now. I never made any significant speech. I knew there was a part of the UN Framework for Climate Change, which was working on this and having various conferences. And it was only after that, in 2002, I came to New York and formed a small NGO to work on economic and social rights. And we had colleagues in Aspen, in Washington, working on right to health, and colleagues in Geneva working on corporate responsibility. And I was working on women, peace and security and other issues. And we were focused on African countries. And I was traveling a lot because if you're very small, you have to partner with the UN, with other organizations. I was also honorary president of Oxfam, as you mentioned, and Oxfam was inviting me to be here and there. And as I went to various countries, I kept hearing this sentence that began, "Oh, but things are so much worse." And it was all about changes in the climate, changes in the weather, unpredictable events. And it was all over. I mean, I went to Liberia because we had a whole program there. I knew Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. I would have breakfast with her in the morning, and she'd explain to me that when she was growing up, the 2 rainy seasons in Liberia were predictable to a few days at the different times of the year. Now, she didn't know when the rainy season would come, for how long it would be, and when it would, and she said, "I can't mend my roads. It's very hard to plan." And that was at one level. And then I was meeting people like Constance O'Kellett, who became a friend through Oxfam, who, growing up in her village in northern Uganda, said, we were poor, but we had enough to eat. And we knew when to sow, we knew when to harvest. But as of about the year 2000 on, the village suffered long periods of drought and then flash flooding that destroyed the school, and then more drought and more flash flooding. And she said, we thought that God was punishing us. And then we learned it wasn't God, it was the lives of rich people. And I thought that was a very significant kind of sense. It was the fossil fuel of the developed parts of the God that were impacting on her village, which was not responsible. And I heard it in Somalia, the Horn of Africa. I had been in Somalia as president in 1992. I was invited by the Irish aid agencies to return to Somalia in 2011 because there was a famine there again. In 1992, I had no sense of any climate dimension, to be honest. It was about warring warlords, and I spoke to both the warlords and tried. In fact, my husband accused me of poking one of them in the tummy, which I don't think I did do, but I may have wagged a finger at him. But anyway.
Do you think it's inconceivable?
Well, I don't admit to it. But in 2011, the background research that I got was that the Horn of Africa had the 8 hottest years in succession. And you could just tell, you could see the devastating impact and that this is going to get worse. And I really became aware that this was one of the most serious human rights issues because it was undermining development, undermining poor livelihoods, undermining health, driving people out of their places where they were living because of flooding, because of severe drought. And that was happening to a huge number of people around the world, but there were people who didn't have a voice at the table. And so at the end of my time working with Realizing Rights, I was already talking about climate change. I'd been to Copenhagen, and in Cancun we formed a troika of women leaders on climate because of the gender dimensions. And we've actually got gender more securely, gender balance into the climate negotiations themselves. Because if you undermine livelihoods and food security, it's women who pick up the pieces. And women, of course, are the large number of farmers in the developing world. And I then came to the energy side, and I'm fascinated at your interest in lighting, because we're now in an era, are we not, where we're just about to see the technology of solar make it a potential contender to be the main energy source. What Tesla and others are doing in battery storage, not just in cars now, but in homes, etc. I mean, this could be what we need to move rapidly to renewable energy, wind and solar, but particularly solar. And thankfully, the sun shines in the most troubled spots, so that can be a real source. I would like to see solar and wind, etc., become like the mobile phone for developing countries, that they leapfrog into the clean energy and don't have to use the dirty energy that we've used, don't have to use fossil fuel energy, but can move in that direction. So I'd love to hear whether you feel that there's another book in solar lighting that could be part of the climate solution.
Bill?
Well, I think it can be part of it, but my own sense is that given the economic forces, particularly in the densely populated countries, developing countries becoming middle-income countries, becoming high-income countries, it's going to be very difficult for the renewable energy sources to displace the fossil fuels. If you just take China and India as 2 examples of countries where there's a long way before any of the renewables will push out, particularly coal. I say that hesitantly because we have really underestimated the progress and the cost declines, particularly in solar, but actually in both areas over the last 20 years. But still, I think there's probably just not enough. There's just not enough earth and not enough wind and not enough economic cost advantage to displace fossil fuels at current prices, and maybe even with technologies 10 to 20 years down the road. So that is what led me and lead me to think that we're actually not going to get there without carbon pricing at a sufficiently high price, so you're basically going to drive the fossil fuels, maybe not out of existence, but you're going to minimize their role, and also you'll find technologies that can clean them either out of the atmosphere or from the smokestacks or from the fuels themselves. But if you look at, I'm afraid if you look at trends, in something called decarbonization, which is how much more efficient we are in producing global output in terms of the CO2 component, then there's been actually very little progress over the last 20 years. The rate of decarbonization is virtually constant. So we're doing better, it is true, but we're not doing better fast enough, and we're going to need to prod this, I won't say animal because someone will object to that, but prod this beast, which is the economy, through I think pretty powerful economic incentives if we're going to get the kind of goals that you envision.
How big a price do we need to put on carbon? Has your thinking evolved over time?
Well, yes to the last question. I mean, we've learned a tremendous amount. I've learned a tremendous amount, but I think we, in this area, I know Dale was here, Dale Jorgensen was here earlier, has been a pioneer, and I've learned a great deal from his work and others here. But I mean, the couple of things we've learned, one is that we're probably going to need pretty high prices to really decarbonize the economy, whether it's $25, $50, or $100 a ton. It'll be enough really to drive coal use essentially to zero, and to economize greatly, at least without being cleaned up, and to economize greatly on the other fossil fuels. But we don't have any clear answer because we really don't. This is something we haven't done. So it's like asking somebody what's the response going to be to a particular medicine when we haven't done any experiments. And we have analog experiments, but we've actually never done it at the kind of scale we need. So I think there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty. But I think as best guess, everybody's best guess is we need a pretty high price to do it.
And do either of you think we've got the political will or the capacity to get there?
Well, it's interesting to see how much support there is now for carbon pricing. I mean, it has come much more into the central debate. At the UN last September during the climate summit, there was a meeting, and a whole range of business leaders signed up, countries signed up to the need for carbon pricing. The trouble is the free riders who don't sign up, and I know you have your idea of a club of countries that are committed. But I think what we're seeing in a way is a new scenario for trying to see where the world is going as we move towards Paris this year. I mean, this is such a big year for decision making. Earlier with some students, I was comparing it with 1945, which I really do. 1945 was the year when the world had been suffering from 2 world wars, a Holocaust, dropping of nuclear bombs in Japan, opening up of the Cold War, and people were kind of driven by that sense of never again, never again. And what did we get? We got the Charter of the United Nations, we got the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, we got a Marshall Plan for Europe, we got a huge global solidarity, and a couple of years later we got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And 2015 is another year like that. There hasn't been quite one since, and now we're there again with the need for the world to change direction on its development, literally, a transformative, behavioral, deep change if we're going to have a safe world for future generations. And it begins with the financing for development in Addis Ababa in July. We have to be innovative in financing. We have to have new commitment to financing for developing countries because they need the investment to have any chance of really being able to go renewable energy. And we then have to have the Sustainable Development Goals, which are for all countries, in September. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and the 13th goal is on climate change, and 12 of the 17 goals, in fact, are relevant to climate and on oceans, etc., and consumption and so on. And they come into effect next January. And then we have the climate agreement in December. And the essential point about the climate agreement is to give integrity to the Sustainable Development Goals by putting us on a pathway to stay below what the governments of the world have said is a safe limit, which is to stay below 2 degrees Celsius of warming above pre-industrial standards. And the world has agreed that. Scientists worry that it may not be, that it may actually be a worrying standard, that in fact at 2 degrees the world could be very disrupted by climate. So we should be trying to stay below 2 degrees, and certainly small island states would go under if we go up to 2 degrees. So we should stay below the 2 degrees. What the French are saying about the climate agreement is that there will be 4 pillars to the agreement. The first will be that climate agreement, where hopefully the 194 countries will agree to a pathway to keep us below 2 degrees. It will probably be quite a short agreement. It's a very important one. The next pillar is that every country has agreed to do what is called, and it's a very clumsy phrase, its intended nationally determined contributions of how it will reduce emissions in 2020, 2025, 2030, 2035, and so on. And the difference is that every country now says, we all have to do this. Some should do more because they have historic responsibility, and there is common but differentiated responsibility in the convention. But every country now is geared to, we have to do as much as we can because it's so serious. And so that is the band of intended nationally determined contributions. We have about 40-something countries, including the United States, that's already indicated what they're going to do, and it's not going to be enough to keep us below 2 degrees. So we're going to have to some way of reviewing and ratcheting up the ambition. So the agreement, the nationally intended contributions, and then the third pillar is the finance, the climate finance, and the technology, the breakthroughs we hope for in the technology. And the fourth one is all the activities that have been taking place on carbon pricing, on carbon smart agriculture, on what cities are doing, the Alliance of Cities, on the New York Declaration and the Lima Strategy on Forests, all of the things that are on what civil society is doing and what communities are doing. And they will all be also part of the accounting in Paris. And to me, that's a very sensible way of going, because Paris is just an important step that has to put us on the right course. We're not going to get there in Paris. We have to be sure that the agreement is such that we know we're not on course, and we have reviews and a commitment to increase the ambition to keep us on course. So I very much agree with you on carbon pricing, but yeah, actually I'm more hopeful than you seem to be that we can do it. I've heard people say we could do it by 2030, that we could have a renewable world if we get the sufficient breakthroughs, particularly on solar battery retention.
Bill?
Well, this is very inspirational. I don't want to rain on a parade in Paris, which is a beautiful city of lights. No, it's not. It's not the City of Lights, but that's a different story. It reminds me of a saying. There was a senator from Louisiana, Russell Long, who was a chief tax writer for the Senate, and he was all in favor of tax reform. And what he would say was, "Don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the fellow behind the tree." And I feel that's where we are in all of this, that we will all gather, we will all agree that on lofty goals, but we will actually not have national programs that are consistent with these goals, and more important, we're unlikely to have programs that would implement them. I mean, we can just start right here in the United States. We don't need to point the finger at, we can start right in this tree.
But look
here.
at California. They're doing pretty well.
If you actually look at the United States actually is another example of a country that has not really, even with all the regulations we've had, the power plant regulations, the car regulations, the regulations of houses and so on, we have not made very much progress. I'll just come back to what I think the problem of the free riding, and the reason I think that Paris will basically stumble the same way the earlier conferences have is because there's no mechanism to induce countries to go beyond some modest goals in terms of their actual implementation. I mean, the U.S. is not close to meeting any ambitious goals. So I think, again, I would like to think it, I would hope it, but I think economists aren't paid to hope. They're paid to calculate and to look at not what people say, but what they do. And outside of Europe, basically, no one is doing anything. And within Europe, the European trading system has basically fallen apart because of another set of issues. So I would like to be able to agree with you that we're doing something, but I think unless we get to the point where we have an agreement that where there's some incentives for countries to actually implement their programs, we're not going to. I would come back to but I want to come back to 1945, which I remember a little bit. I was just out of diapers, but I do remember. So if you look at the Bretton, I want to go back to the Bretton Woods agreements, which were very interesting agreements. And the Bretton Woods exchange rate agreement lasted until 1971, so that's pretty good. The actual institutions have survived to this day, although the WTO is quite different from what the original design was. But they had a completely different design from a point of view of treaty design, and that was they had a small number of countries, like two, the United States and Britain, designing institutions, and they were designing institutions that they thought countries would eventually want to join, and when they would join, would improve either the finance in the case of the IMF or trade in the case of what is now the WTO. So it's a completely different design from this bottom-up, what I call the bottom-up treaties, that are the treaties of the IPCC and the organizations associated with that. So my own thought is what you need is something actually quite like the Bretton Woods treaties, where you get a small number of countries to think what kind of treaty would be one that not only would be one people would want to join the way they want now to join the WTO, but would also be ones that would eventually, as they began to tighten, be able to attain maybe not a 2-degree goal, but something better than the trajectory that we're on now. And I think until we get to the point where we're thinking of treaty design with incentives for countries to join into something that has costly domestic steps, actually it's going to be slightly painful for countries to take these steps, and they're going to have to take it not because they want to take it for their own national economic interests, but because and not because they're altruistic, because countries that have limited altruism or limited regard for other countries' welfare, but because, as in the case of the WTO, it's part of the rules of the game. In the WTO, the rules of the game are you have to keep your tariffs low, and if you don't, you'll have other countries put tariffs on you. So it has to be the rules of the game that you have to do steep emissions reductions, and if you don't, there will be consequences. The problem with the current design is that we've had since Kyoto is there are no consequences if countries just go about their business and do whatever they want. So I think that's where I see the missing ingredient in the pillars. Maybe the French, maybe it's asymmetric and not French to have 5 pillars, but you need a 5th pillar in that, which is something that harnesses countries' self-interest to deep and steep emissions reductions or else. And that, I think, is what is missing.
So we do have time for a few questions. There's a microphone here, up here, and right here. And so I'm hoping some of you are curious enough to ask a question. Now, let me just explain. This is probably the last time in my life I get to say this. A good question at the Kennedy School consists of 3 elements. First, you identify yourself. Second, you keep it relatively short with one thought. And third, it should end with a question mark. So with that.
My name is Charlie Clements. I'm with the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. My question this afternoon is Professor Nordhaus. In the fall of 2002, you published an economic study that countered the Bush administration theory that the war in Iraq would be self-paying for, but that the economic revenues gained by the increase in oil production would pay for the cost of the war, and it would cost us absolutely nothing. And of course, that turned out to be erroneous. But I was curious what kind of reaction you had to your study. It was a breath of fresh air at the time. It turned out to be very modest, I think, in terms of the actual cost of the war, as Joseph Stiglitz showed later. But if you could talk about the response to that, I'd be very appreciative.
Oh, that was actually an interesting month. That took about a month's work, and so this was done about 5 months before the war started. The war began, and it was a little bit like lighting in the sense it was a pretty offbeat field. There was actually very little work. Defense economics, as it was called, had declined in the economics profession. There was virtually nothing at that time being written in the area. I was a little shocked, actually. And the person who encouraged that was Carl Kazin. He had read an early draft and said, well, you have a couple of inflammatory things, you should take this out. But otherwise, he encouraged it. I'll just mention 2 reactions I got. One was from a member of the Treasury who said to somebody who told me, he said, Nordhaus is crazy. And I don't know what he meant by that. But I think he meant that he's got this vivid imagination for all the things that can go wrong, and we in the Treasury know they're not going to go wrong. And then I got the sweetest letter I ever got from Ken Galbraith, who said, I have 2 piles in my office, one for papers that are okay, and one's for papers that I read and I think are important, and yours goes in that pile. And that was a really nice, that was one of the nicest letters I ever got. So I think in retrospect, it was a kind of, it turns out to be very difficult. I'll mention something about the Stiglitz and colleague here, Linda Bilmes. Is it Bilmes? Bilmes, who did a great study. And one of the things that was omitted in, I just overlooked, was the injuries and the cost to the U.S. of the, I actually thought about it, but I thought about the fatalities, but I didn't really think about the injuries at all. Had no conception about what they would be, the scale of them, and how costly, not just to the federal budget, but as a society that would be. But I think as I look back, the reason I think this has any enduring value, if you want to know what people thought before going into the war, you might want to read it, because it's really hard to reconstruct the optimism and the jingoism and the way people thought this was we're just going to blow right through and it's going to pay for itself. After this long series, this disaster and other disasters, fiscal and military, I find it really hard to remember how optimistic we were in the fall and spring of that year.
Thank you. Right over here.
Yes, I'm Catherine Sickink, the Ryan Family Professor of Human Rights Policy here at the Kennedy School, and I have a question for Mary Robinson that also goes back to that same period as Charlie's question. I heard you speak very eloquently after 9/11, at a time when you called the 9/11 bombings that they could be considered a crime against humanity, and you suggested a vision of using law as a way to approach that crime against humanity. And I wonder if you could just play out for us a possible counterfactual that might not have involved this very expensive war that might have been effective about confronting terrorism.
Yes, I remember very well because my final year as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights started on 9/11. I just served for a year until the year after. So when the terrible attacks took place, I came to New York and went to Ground Zero, met families, met the FEMA people who were working on it and others, and sat in my office to think, what does this mean for human rights? And we were quite clear that these were crimes against humanity. When you have airplanes full of gas and people aimed at buildings to kill as many people as possible, there's no doubt this would constitute a crime against humanity under international law. And immediately after 9/11, there was that sense that the world was with the United States, and we must remember that. I mean, every country in the world was saying, you know, expressing sympathy, expressing empathy, outraged at what had happened. And the Security Council passed a resolution that sort of brought us much further on in addressing terrorism than we had been, just by the sheer need to be together on this. And I think if there had been a determination to go after the perpetrators of crimes against humanity, which was in fact Osama bin Laden and his and those who were with him in Afghanistan, but we were already hearing a very different way of addressing this, which was the war on terrorism. And war is a very kind of broad sweep way of doing things. There were people swept up just after 9/11 and so on. And it also doesn't prioritize or balance the need to protect human rights. And I felt then, and I feel still very strongly, that the way to counter those who want to undermine values is to uphold those values. Yes, you have to protect your people. Yes, you have to secure them. You have to take measures. You can, in fact, take emergency measures under international human rights law. But the focus should be on addressing what the issues were, the crime against humanity. It would have been possible to bring Osama bin Laden before an international tribunal. A tribunal could be set up for that. It would have been a very different world, I think, and probably not have us now in the morass of what we see in the wider Middle East.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Arthur Applebaum. I teach political philosophy at the Kennedy School. So I have a question for both of you. So you're both exquisitely sensitive to the passage of time, both the very, very distant future and the past. Mary Robinson, you talk about your grandchildren. Bill Nordhaus, you talk about Babylonia and the founding of the university, and of course you're projecting the consequences, both of you, of many, 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 many years into the future of climate change. But it turns out that it's unclear how we're supposed to think about that. I mean, I'm not an economist, but I'm a fellow traveler, and we think we've solved the problem. We've got this thing called the discount rate, right? But of course, as you know, the most careful, sophisticated modeling, economic modeling, is going to be very, very sensitive to very small changes in the discount rate. And I don't mean simply building in adjustments for inflation and opportunity costs, but the pure time preference, right? And of course, Mary Robinson, I don't think you think about the pure time preference, but surely you have a sense of how are we supposed to care about people 100 years from now? So I'm asking not as a technical matter of modeling, but rather just as a normative matter. How are we supposed to care about people who are going to live 200 years from now?
Well, curiously, I'll start with the fact that when my first grandchild was born, who's now the 11-year-old, I did have some kind of, I can only describe it as a kind of physical reaction to the joy of his birth, the pride in his birth. He was the first child of my daughter when I was 2. And in some strange way, I recalibrated. And I began to care about 100 years hence, because that was going to be his life. I mean, I'm talking as a grandmother now. And that also links very much with how I think about 2050 and what that world will be like for the 9 billion people who have to find food and water and live together and have the energy they can use, and what kind of energy it'll be. And so for me, it's extraordinarily real, if I could put it that way. I really think about it in a very tangibly real way, because I relate to it and I care about it. And I took part in the march last September in New York, the big climate march before the climate summit. And it was a great pleasure to be with so many people. I mean, they predicted there would be 100,000. In fact, 400,000 people came out. And we all wanted to be there with everybody else. And there were banners about all kinds of things. I was with Gru Brundtland, and it was a pleasure to be with her as a fellow elder. And we had our elders banner, and we had a crowd around us who were, seeing us as elders on the march. And then I saw another banner that I tried to sort of move towards, but we were wedged in together because there were so many of us that you couldn't really move except when the crowd moved slowly forward. And the banner that I wanted to go behind, at least for a little while, was Angry Grannies, because I felt this is the one that really speaks to me, And what I really think more and more, and it gets me out of bed in the morning, is we are facing an existential threat. It's the first time we've had this kind of issue, an existential threat. The World Bank has written about what a 4-degree world would be like. It's a report a couple of years ago called Turn Down the Heat. And they extrapolated, and it is catastrophic. And we are facing at least a 4-degree world at the moment. That's where the scientists tell us. I was in the Potsdam Institute a couple of weeks ago with my colleagues. We work closely with John Schelling. He's one of our advisors, a very well-known climate scientist. And at a certain point when John Schelling was showing us all these graphs and things, I said, well, just spell out in very plain English to me. I'm a non-scientist. I've come late to climate, but I now see it as a big human rights issue. What does staying below 2 degrees Celsius really mean in practical terms? And he says what it really means in practical terms is getting to 0 carbon by 2050 globally. 0 carbon means we have about a 60% chance of staying below 2 degrees Celsius. 60% chance, which is, that good a chance. And I wonder what it will take. Yes, carbon pricing, I would be all for it, because that's one economic lever that would get us there. But how can we be so strangely uncaring about our children and grandchildren, that we're not coming together much more in a sense of global solidarity? Because no country can do it on their own. The United States can't protect itself from the impacts of climate change, and nor can any other part of the world. It's like as if we're in a Titanic, to simplify things. We're heading for the rocks of the kind of tipping points of climate change. And if we hit those tipping points, then it's not just those in steerage, it's the first-class passengers. Everybody will suffer. And I think the current foreign minister of France, Laurent Fabius, has said a number of times, and I think he pretty well uses it now in every speech he says, we are the first generation to understand the dangers of climate change and the last generation with time to do something about it. Now, for me, I read actually, and I meant to bring it along with me because I was going to blame you, David, among others, because you're a teacher, a dean of the thing, that young people in the United States don't regard climate change as high on their agenda. If that's true, it's incredibly serious, because it should be one of the highest things on young people's agenda, because it's their lives and it's their futures. And,
it's my fault.
Your fault, yes.
I've been saying, no, don't worry. Be happy, yeah. Bill?
That's a really interesting question. I think there's a kind of technical question that you alluded to about what people use in investments, either public investments or private investments. But I don't really want to go there, because we could. I think that's actually not the crucial issue. I think one issue is that many of our political institutions behave as if they have very high discount rates or short time horizons. And the time that became very vivid to me was when the U.S. almost defaulted on its national debt because of a stalemate in the Congress. I don't actually know whether we were that as close as some thought, but it was close enough. If something had gone wrong, then there had been some kind of, in this game of chicken, some kind of stalemate, that there could have been some pretty terrible consequences for the United States. And there was nothing to justify it other than political bargaining. But to think that a country would put its good faith and credit on the line, the country with the strongest and most mature and important financial system in the world on the line, is a kind of sense of the high political discount rate or the low short time horizon of some of our institutions. So I worry much more about that than I do Yale's discount rate or Harvard's discount rate or the discount rate of individuals here. But I want to, just a slightly different point. So then I asked the question, okay, what is it that is important passing on to the next generation? I think the discount rate issue doesn't really get at that either. And I think one of the things Mary's alluded to is the natural environment. But I think also I think the physical capital and the tangible capital and things like that are less important than the institutions we pass on. The institutions of good governance, institutions like our colleges and universities and our school systems. And so if I worry about any specific thing that we're not passing on in a responsible intergenerational way, I worry less about, I don't like potholes, but I worry less about potholes and infrastructure than I do about the quality of our institutions, and particularly our political institutions. And and also our international institutions, quality of our international institutions. There is some good news, after all, in terms of the declining lethality of interstate conflicts. That's really good news. If you look at what's happened to deaths in wars per million people, that is way down, and that's good news. Now, there are always obviously risks there of nuclear war, but there are some good news. But we still, I think the place I would focus on in the international arena are international institutions, and to the extent that it's climate change, some of the things I said earlier.
Seems like a great note to end on. I would just simply say I will take the blame for the political institutions as well. We, after all, are the Kennedy School. But I'd rather turn to the end of the way, which is that this actually is an institution that thinks it's our job to try and fix those. And with our hearts and our heads and our hands, I think this is an unbelievably important moment. And thank you for demonstrating that those things can be put to good use and to, as I say, really symbolize the kind of values that we admire. So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking and admiring.